Hey guys, I'm sorry I can't be with you today. But what I wanted us to do today was I wanted us to go ahead and review this short story, The Landlady, because we read part one during a time period when testing had begun, and then we did some vocabulary work before reading part two. And so I'm worried that maybe we don't remember what happened from part one to part two, or maybe some of you missed some days. So I'm going to read both parts together and try to help you clarify and get a little bit better understanding. Okay, so one thing we've talked about before is that this author, Roald Dahl, he's a very famous author, and that we probably have recognized his name before because he wrote books like James and the Giant Peach or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But this is a very different type of story. This is a horror story or a suspense story, which you'll learn more about suspense when you are in seventh grade language arts. Okay, so another issue about reading Roald Dahl is that he wrote his stories a long time ago, so the language is real old fashioned, and also he lived in Britain, or England, basically, which means that he's making references and using language that we don't always use in America. Okay, so let's reread part one together first. Billy Weaver had traveled down from London on the slow afternoon train, with a change at Swindon on the way. And by the time he got to Bath, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear, starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile along on the other side." Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. "Find your own lodgings," he had said, "and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at the head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Okay, now we're going to move to part two, which we just read this week. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa, and several plump armchairs. And in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evenings and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper too. He had stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, and to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast, it said. Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing. And then at once, it must have been at once, because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button. The door swung open, and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring the bell and you have at least a half-minute's wait before the door opens, but this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump. Okay, so now you've had some time to reread and think about some new ideas related to this story, and especially to the setting. So, what is something new that you have learned when you reread the story compared to the first time we read it in class? If you need to watch this video again, you can. Otherwise, go ahead and move on to the next question, which is to tell me something new that you learned that you didn't think about the first time you read the story.